argument is how do we deal with the executive branch, okay? And I apologize, it's kind of difficult to read. I wonder if I put this down more, if it'll eliminate some of that glare. Better? Maybe? Okay, but how do we create this executive, right? We don't want it to be like King George. How are they gonna be chosen? But the fear is that if we put this in the hands of the people, directly in the hands of the people are going to elect somebody who is an uneducated, bumbling idiot. So we should not allow the people to have direct control over electing the President of the United States, because the American people, the majority of them, are uneducated and don't know anything really about a democracy or how a democracy should function. And so therefore, like, we have to have some sort of protectorate. Does that make sense? On top of that, we have 13 colonies at this point. We have an expanse that is growing westward, right? None of these are yet states, but they are territories. So how do we deal with this growing piece of land, right? In an age where we don't have email, we don't have phones, we don't have computers to be able to bring all of this voting information into a centralized location, right? So how do we deal with this and still make sure that there is fairness, but also that the person who is most qualified for the job is the person that is put into the job? Does that make sense? And also we have to make sure that there's fairness between the colonies. Because if it is just based on sheer population and sheer vote, it means that Virginia will basically always elect the President of the United States at the time, because Virginia has the highest population of any of the colonies. Today, what state would elect the President? California. Okay? And a state like North Dakota, it would not make a difference if North Dakotans voted one way or the other, because they would never get any person into office, ever. Does that make sense? Because the population doesn't exist. So how do we create this checks and balance? And what they come up is with the Electoral College. I get the Electoral College today is under a huge debate as to whether it still has a significance. But here's what you need to understand about the Electoral College back then and today. One, it was designed to protect the office of the presidency from an uneducated electorate, because the Electoral College, even though the electors are chosen by the party, does that make sense? So like in North Dakota, which pretty much always goes Republican, there's been a few times that we haven't, but 99% of the time we go Republican. Or you do, I don't, because I live in Minnesota, so we go Democrats in Minnesota. So
even during the landslide election,
what do I?
only state in the union that did not vote was like Reagan.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah, Dylan has it on his
You guys are just so difficult.
I didn't live there at that time. I wasn't even,
Everyone
I
said
was
like
alive. I was in Wyoming.
everyone
I was
said
little. Okay, anyways, so North Dakota, right? North Dakota, we get 3 electoral votes, okay? Now, it might not seem like a lot, right? And you might be like, oh, wow, 3 electoral votes, right? But here's the deal. North Dakota, in those 3 electoral votes, we actually have a greater voice than California residents do. Proportionately. Because if you look at their number of electors via the population, like
It's like 55.
their individual votes count less in California than your individual votes in North Dakota do. Okay, proportionately to population via electoral votes. So you actually, as individual residents of North Dakota, actually have more say than Californians do. It may not seem like that because you only get 3 electoral votes, but that is the reality of it. Does that make sense? Okay. So we're going to protect it from an uneducated electorate, because even though those 3 Republican electorates in North Dakota, they don't have to actually vote for the Republican candidate. They usually do, because that would be like political suicide, because most of the time they're appointed people by the party, and they're people that have worked for the Republican ticket to get whoever, you know, is in to be president, and they have political aspirations themselves. So it would be political suicide for them not to, but technically can vote whatever way they want. Those 3 people in North Dakota can vote for any person that they want when they actually log their electoral vote. Does that make sense? Now, some states you have to vote for whoever it goes to, but North Dakota, they don't. Okay, Minnesota, you don't either, okay? So we're going to have that, right? And we're going to have, it'll also then create a checks and balance between the big states and the large states. Now, if we went to a sole vote by population, which has been a big argument these days, right? Because if you look at the last few elections and you look at the popular vote versus the electoral vote, there have been numerous instances in which the person who has the more votes in the popular vote has not gotten the electoral votes needed in order to get the office of the presidency, right? And people are like, well, that's why we should eliminate the electoral college.
No.
But keep in mind, if you eliminate the electoral college,
You have like no vote then.
then North Dakota has no say. It will be California, and whether you like it or don't like it, you're probably gonna wind up with a very liberal person in the White House forever. Does that make sense?
California, New York.
Okay? Yeah, because California, New York,
So
Florida, okay, those are ones that are going to dictate. Does that make sense? Who becomes president? So like it or not, the Electoral College actually does still serve a purpose, even in our modern day.
Because
Okay?
they just campaign California then.
But that becomes one of the things. I already talked about that,
We
sorry.
just need to make more people
Okay,
our babies.
next piece. The next argument is how do we limit the power of the government, okay? Well, we do that by creating a system of checks and balances. So each one has a specific job, and each one of the other branches then has the ability to check the other branch. Does that make sense? Okay, so if we look at this in practice, the executive, okay, can veto a law passed by the legislature. I'm really sorry that that black is so hard to see. And it's still bad, sorry. So he can veto a law, he can declare war, okay? So he can declare war, he can propose laws, he can sign an executive order too, although executive orders are meant to be temporary. They're not meant to be permanent orders, they're meant to be temporary. He also gets to appoint members of his cabinet and appoint judges, okay? His cabinet members must be approved by Congress. Congress can override his veto by a 2/3 vote. They have the power to actually declare war long-term. The president, as part of the War Powers Act, it wasn't initially set up with dates or timeframes, but as a result of the War Powers Act post-Vietnam, we see they have 90 days for Congress to approve a declaration of war, and without that approval, we have to remove our troops. Does that make sense? So it's 90 days. Question?
No, like,
No.
wait, so if they declare war in 90 days to make it legal? Or?
Yes, basically.
If
So
who declares
as
war?
president,
Either
you are the head of our military,
Yep,
okay?
aren't you?
So as you're the commander-in-chief, you have the right to send troops into wherever you want. But there is a 90-day window in which Congress must approve that movement of troops into that region and that declaration of war. If Congress does not approve that declaration of war within 90 days, the troops must be removed.
Is Congress legislative?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, sorry, the legislature, yeah.
So, like hypothetically, like Trump could like put troops in North Korea for 90 days. They could like go to
For
war.
90 days.
They could go do whatever they want for 90 days,
For 90 days,
and then after 90 days, they have to come back.
yes.
For how long before they like charge up and
Unless-
go
Send it
Unless
back the next day.
Congress-
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. It is not the War Powers Act as it was written. It is a result of the Vietnam War, okay?
Mhm.
And it is a result of Johnson's escalation into Vietnam under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. We'll talk more about it as we get there. It has not been tested in that way. Does that make sense, Bo? So
Those that would
we have
not
always
support it.
had congressional approval within those 90 days prior to that point. So we have never reached any situation where we've had to know, okay, does it have to be a 6-month like break time, or like you have to take a day break and then you can go back in, or what does that look like? We don't know because it hasn't been tested, okay? But that's a result of the passage of the War Powers Act post-Vietnam. Does that make sense? So that's way down the road. It's talked about in the Constitution, but it's not specific as to how that works in the Constitution. Does that make sense? Yes, no, so and so. Right.
Can the legislative impeach the president during an executive order?
As a result of an executive order?
During it, like if he
Like-
just stays in it.
Oh, so like if he signs an executive order and it becomes, like you're saying it becomes a permanent action?
Yeah.
Well,
How will they stop him?
it's not a
They just don't
permanent
do it.
action unless it's actually passed as a law. Does that make sense? So it's not a permanent action, period. It might seem like it's a permanent action, but it's not. So you look at, for example, Obama passed an executive order, signed an executive order that allowed for DACA, okay, the Deferred Action on Childhood,
Aliens, criminal
something, yeah, okay? But DACA was never a permanent thing, so
But people think it
next
is.
president comes along, he removes DACA. Trump removes DACA, ends DACA. Does that make sense? Okay? So it's never a permanent thing, it's just how long that president or subsequent president wants to let that go. Okay? So when you look at like Donald Trump's executive order preventing people from immigrating to the United States based on your country of origin, right? That's an executive order. It's not permanent. So it's not like it has a specified time limit on it, but let's say he's out of there in 4 years, the next president comes along and can remove it, or just doesn't enforce it anymore. Does that make sense? Or in this instance, what's happening is the judges and the courts are challenging it, and so it could be basically overturned or ruled unconstitutional as a result of that executive order. He cannot be impeached, though, unless he violates the rule of law. Does that make sense? Okay? So he has to do something illegal in order to be impeached. So like Clinton goes through impeachment proceedings because he lied under oath. It's not because he had an affair with Monica Lewinsky, that's why he lied under oath, but he's impeached because he lied under oath. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay? Nixon is impeached because, in part, he lied under oath, and 2, he also was in the mix of rigging an election. So, does that make sense? Okay? They tried, or they were originally going to bring up Washington on impeachment charges too.
For what?
Yeah, George Washington. Okay. Congress argues that he oversteps his bounds because of the Jay Treaty. Jay Treaty, because John Jay shouldn't have gone and signed a treaty. Does that make sense? So, yeah, because he's Supreme Court.
He's still there.
Oh, yeah, that's under Adams, but what was it under Washington then? I don't remember now. I'll have to think about it. You're right, because that was under
Do you really want
Adams, because
like
the J, that's,
president?
you're right.
Okay.
But so they have those checks and balances, right? For the judicial branch can declare an act of Congress or an act of the president unconstitutional. Does that make sense? So if you look at, for example, Executive Order 9066, which puts Japanese Americans into internment camps as a result of World War II and the bombing at Pearl Harbor, the Supreme Court will rule on a case called Korematsu v. U.S. In that case, they rule that it is, in fact, constitutional to remove a person's civil liberties during times of war if the national interests are at stake. Does that make sense? They could have declared it unconstitutional. They don't. Okay? Now, there's an effect of that, right? A long-term effect of that, okay? Is that technically any of your civil liberties can be removed from you when we are at war.
Like,
Including you can be incarcerated because of your nation of origin.
Not based on the vague statement.
Or based on some other vague threat that your people pose to the United States. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's these checks and balances that exist. That's how we're going to prevent one branch from getting any greater control than any of the others. Mind you, though, until the passage of the Judiciary Act, the judicial branch is the weakest of all of the branches of the government. Okay? So, and we'll talk about that, so don't worry about it just yet. The next debate has to deal with slavery and representation when it comes to slavery. The southern states, their white population is limited, but they have a very large slave population. Of people within your state, you want everybody in your state to count towards representation, not just the white people in your state to count towards representation.
Wait, slaves are more than property now?
Well, just wait, okay? Well, that's the debate. Are slaves actually people, or are they just property? If we're gonna count a slave for representations, why wouldn't it be any different to count, like, the number of cows you have, or the number of chickens you have, or whatever else? I get in today's context, in today's world, that may seem like horrible for me to say, but that's the reality of it at the time, right? Slaves are property. They're nothing more than a chicken or a cow. So I'm not going to count cows towards representation. Why would I count slaves towards representation? As a northerner, that's their argument, and it makes no sense for them. As a southerner, if the North does not count my slaves towards population, the North can dictate anything and everything that they want. Well, you're already seeing states like Pennsylvania begin to pass the gradual emancipation laws. So if this is already the way that the North is going, the North, if they have greater power in Congress because of population, then the North will eliminate slavery. Do you see where this for the Southerners is an issue, right? And becomes a sticking point. But they're property, so why would we count them as a full person? Well, the compromise that comes out of that is for every 5 slaves, they will count for 3 people towards representation.
Such a weird equation.
Okay? So they're basically 3/5 of a person.
Jeez.
What was the law?
What's that?
Wasn't there like a special name, like a?
3/5.
3/5 compromise.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the special name. We're really inventive, right? The 3/5 compromise. Okay? That way the southern states get what they want, but the northern states also get what they want, right? Now, because of it, the southern states do wind up dominating the House of Representatives because they do have a larger population, even when you include just 3/5 of their population, or slaves as 3/5. Does that make sense? Okay, 3/5 of a person. But it works, and it gives them that compromise. The second part of that compromise, I'm going to go through a little bit more because I already kind of talked about this, so I apologize. This is just numbers anyways. The second part of that compromise is it also includes a fugitive slave law. Understand, states, Pennsylvania, right, gradual abolition, but they also begin to pass things called personal liberty laws, which makes it so that somebody who escapes slavery, flees to Pennsylvania, cannot be brought back into slavery. Well, the argument of the southern slave owners is, well, those slaves are my property. I own them. It's like a cow that gets out of the pasture.
I thought you were arguing against the cow.
Well, not the southerners aren't. The northerners are arguing against the cow. The southerners aren't. They're saying it's the equivalent of a cow. I'm sorry, I get where you guys are saying, like, Johnson, this is absolutely horrible that you're saying this. But you have to look at it, I'm arguing from their perspective. Does that make sense? They're saying, look, that slave is nothing more than like a piece of cattle, Okay, they are my property. And so if a cow gets out of the fence, it is still my cow. And I rightfully still own the cow, and therefore you should return said cow to me. And if it was an actual cow and not a slave, you would have no argument, and you would also have no qualms in returning it to me. Because if we look at the ideals of John Locke, right, even though we don't write property in there, we do life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Our intent is property. And it's my property, so therefore,
It's yours.
the government cannot deprive me of my property without due process of law. Does that make sense? It is my property. So if they get out, you have to give me back my property. But the North is already not doing this. And so in order to reach a compromise to get the Constitution ratified, they put into the Constitution a fugitive slave provision. Okay? So if my slaves escape, they're still my property, and I can get them back. Does that make sense? Okay. The last of the compromises is how do we divide the powers? What should be the supreme law of the land? Under the Articles of Confederation, who had, the most power?
States.
The states. Why the states?
They don't want a strong centralized government
Why?
to.
Because it's not a revolution, it doesn't.
Yeah, because we just had a revolution because of that, and we don't want another monarchy, right? But how did that work, having the states have the most amount of power?
Nothing got done.
Yeah, it was a hot mess, right? So how do we fix that hot mess? We're gonna have to change it. But there are states that are like, no, we don't want a strong centralized government. Still, we don't want that. So how do we come up with this, right? And again, the Constitution is built on those series of compromises, okay? Ultimately, they decide to divide it up in 3 levels, with at the top of that level is the national government. The Constitution then becomes the supreme law of the land. So in practice, in today's world, okay, federally, marijuana is illegal. Period. It's a Schedule I narcotic. Okay? Does that make sense? Do you understand the difference between like Schedule I, II, III, etc.? 1 is like the bad of the bad. Okay? So it is considered a Schedule I narcotic. And it is illegal in the United States of America. Period. I know some of you are going to say, well, like medicinally, it's legal in Minnesota, and it's legal for whatever in Colorado, and no, it is illegal in the United States of America, period, because the Constitution and the federal government is the supreme law of the land, period. Does that make sense? So Colorado is breaking the law. Minnesota is breaking the law, and all other states that have any laws that legalize any amount of marijuana use, it is illegal. Now, the state isn't going to enforce that law, but could the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, come in and arrest anybody and everybody who has possession of anything related to marijuana? Yes.
They could, in like.
Yes. Yes. Because the supreme law of the land is the federal government, which says no marijuana.
How are they allowed to do it?
How are they allowed to do it? Because at this point in time, the DEA has not gone in and enforced it. Does that make sense? They have not cracked down on it. It becomes what we call the test case, ultimately. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So ultimately what will happen is somebody will be arrested. It will go all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court of the United States will rule on whether or not marijuana is legal or not. It's the exact same precedent that just happened with I can't remember how to pronounce it. It's like Obergefell, something like that. V. Hodges, which ultimately ruled that gay marriage is legal in the United States. Does that make sense?
So it's just like a thing they don't want to deal with now?
At this point in time, they are not dealing with it. They are just kicking the can down the road. They're not dealing with it. It will, at some point in
Yeah,
time,
it's-
have to be dealt with on a federal level, just like gay marriage had to be dealt with on a federal level. Does that make sense?
Let's do it.
Do they like use bias when they're trying to find the person to arrest? Like they try and find the worst person, or?
Not necessarily. It depends on how they run the test case. Does that make sense?
people.
Sometimes what happens is like, okay, let's look at, like, for example, in Virginia, there was a law on the books that prevented black and whites from getting married. Okay? So a young couple, or they're younger, but they have a family, they're married, they live together, whatever. They're arrested for violating Virginia statute, in which the case is Loving v. Virginia, yeah. They're arrested because they violated this case law. Does that make sense? Well, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, like them, love them, hate them, whatever, the ACLU comes in to defend Loving. Does that make sense? To defend the family. It goes from Virginia statute, right? So they've been arrested for the crime in Virginia. In Virginia, they're convicted of the crime. The ACLU appeals that conviction. It then goes to district court, okay? It is appealed at the district court level. So there are 12 circuit courts in the United States, district courts in the United States. It's appealed at that level, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then can decide whether they want to hear the case or not hear the case. Does that make sense? So you can appeal the case up there. The Supreme Court will either say, nope, we're not going to touch this case, or yes, we are going to touch this case. Does that make sense? Supreme Court decided to take the Loving v. Virginia case, and they ultimately ruled that it is a violation of a person's due process rights, okay, and their rights as citizens under the 14th Amendment to prevent citizens from marrying based on race. That precedent was ultimately used in the gay marriage case as well. It's the same legal precedent. Does that make sense? But they have to rule on constitutionality based on the Constitution itself or based on an amendment to the Constitution. So the case has to violate one of those things in order for it to actually go up to the Supreme Court. Okay?
Do each of those like 12 circuit courts, like, are they all different, like in varying of like power?
No, they're all equitable in power, but they only control their region.
So there's
Does that
like-
make sense?
So they're like spread out throughout the country, like,
Yeah.
like in the, like, so for North Dakota, it'd be like,
So North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, I believe, if I remember right, Iowa, Nebraska, Montana, and Wyoming, I think are all in the same circuit.
oh wow, that's a big circuit.
Okay? It is because the population of a lot of those
Yeah.
states is really small.
So then like where like they meet, like
Okay.
they just pick a courthouse to do
Yeah,
that?
they rotate where, I believe, if I remember correct, for the most part, depending on what's going on. Or where the case is originating
'Cause
from,
it-
sometimes changes too.
Wasn't it a circuit court that challenged Trump's ban, like out of like
Yes,
out of like Oregon or something?
yes. There were several, but one was, yes, out of that region. The reason why ultimately gay marriage goes to the federal government and the Supreme Court had to rule on it is because within a district, you had some states in the district that had laws saying gay marriage was illegal, and you had some states in that said that gay marriage was legal. But then the district would rule either in favor of or against gay marriage. And so some of those states are like, well, wait. We don't agree with that, right? And so then because it
They
becomes a
report to the
dispute
judiciary.
between the states, the federal government has to deal with it. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
What was the federal government's, like, for, like, initial, like view on gay marriage? Like, before,
Before that,
they made, like, the,
The
they just
states-
didn't run a rule on it.
they just didn't really have, like, do they supposed to?
it just was something they just kept pushing down the road. Does that make sense? I mean, part of it is socially, what you, maybe is more difficult for your generation to understand because it's different for you than it is for like my generation. But like, when I was your age, yeah, sure, we had gay classmates, but there was no way on God's green earth that they would have been out and open in high school. Does that make sense? Like, nope. Okay. I was in high school when Matthew Shepard, who was a University of Wyoming student, there's a lot of backstory to it, but basically he got beat up and tied to a fence post and left to die. He was gay. Ellen lost her sitcom because she came out on live TV that she was gay, or on national TV that she was gay, and her character was gay. So she basically lost her show. So it was a lot different world than it is today. Does that make sense? When The Real World was on and they had openly gay people on the show, it was like revolutionary that was being shown on TV. And there were plenty of people that were arguing that the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which regulates TV and music and all that jazz, should shut down The Real World because of the fact that it was showing gays on TV. Does that make sense? So you have to understand, like, the world you guys live in when it comes to homosexuality is an entirely different world than the world that I grew up in. And I'm 34 years old. So I'm not that much older than you. That kind of gives you a context of how much things have changed in just my lifetime. Does that make sense? Yeah. In the 1980s, AIDS was called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency disorder. Because the only way you got it was if you were gay. Okay, so I was born in 1983. Does that make sense, guys? I mean, like, it's a huge amount of change in a very short amount of time. I would argue because of people like Ellen DeGeneres, because of MTV's Real World, as like, much as you may hate reality television that it spawned, but it's because of them that a lot of that change has occurred. Does that make sense? I mean, you can turn on network television today and see a gay couple kiss on network television. When I was your age, Does that make sense? Okay, no way. Does that kind of answer your
Now
question?
Ellen designs nice comforters.
What?
I said now Ellen designs really nice comforters and bedspreads and kitchenware.
Yeah.
We sell that Bed Bath & Beyond as well.
All sorts of stuff, okay? But I mean, that's the reality of it, you know? I mean, and now above and beyond that, we also have Caitlyn Jenner. You know?
I thought she was switching back, like I heard.
I have no idea. I don't think so, but I don't know.
That was like a rumor.
Okay?
Probably.
All right, because of the Constitution, we wind up seeing the rise of political parties, okay? And we need, in order for the Constitution to be approved, according to the way the Constitution is written, you have to have 2/3 of majority in order to change the Constitution, which means of the 13 colonies, we need 9 to ratify. Now, technically, we actually needed all 13 to ratify because, you know, under the Articles of Confederation, in order to change it, you need 13. But that never happens, so, I
That
mean,
never happens.
and technically, you could say that our Constitution has never really been ratified, but we'll just go with it, okay?
That's a legitimate.
You need 9 to ratify, okay?
Like the Pope's.
Technically, all of it's illegal under the Articles of Confederation. But, yeah.
Don't point that out.
Everything's
Okay. There are 2 different groups. There are the Federalists. They argue that our Constitution that we have written is strong enough, it stands on its own. It needs nothing else to it. It is perfect the way that it is written.
But Constitution.
It is written in which, the Constitution, it is written in which the rights of the people are protected, the rights of the states are protected, and the federal government, because of the elastic clause, can do what it needs to do in order to ensure that our government survives in a long-term democracy. Okay? So we have individuals like Washington, Franklin, Adams, Madison, and Hamilton, who are all Federalists, right? It's fine the way it is. Virginian, Virginian, Virginian. Okay.
Educated.
Educated, okay? It's fine the way that it is, okay? In our first attempt at ratifying the Constitution, okay? Delaware will ratify it. Pennsylvania will ratify it. New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. 5. How many do we need? 9. We're not there, okay? Go back to the drawing board, okay? So they began through the publication of what are called the Federalist Papers to try to get this passed. But we also have the other side who's largely preventing it from going through. These individuals who argued that if it is not written down, your rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, notice how they throw property in there too, are not protected if it is not written in stone. Because if we look at England, and we look at our past and our history, we had rights.
Verbal rights, not one.
We had verbal rights. We had some even that were written down, okay, in the Magna Carta.
But that's just like.
That's a nice word.
Yeah, you're right, it's just a basis, but we had rights, right? And they still weren't guaranteed to us. They still were trampled on. So there's no way we can even ensure that a government, a constitution, is going to protect the rights of the people. What about the rights of the states, for that matter? And we'll have to pick up with that on Monday. Yes, they were.
Federalist.
Are you an anti-federalist?
I don't know. I thought it was.
I was like a strong federalist back then. It
Yes,
was like
it is on Google.
a personality
Yeah.
test.
I'll